Tim Johnston is the author of the novels Distant Suns, Descent, The Current, the award-winning story collection Irish Girl, and the young adult novel Never So Green. A carpenter for most of his adult life, he has also taught creative writing at the George Washington University and the University of Memphis. He is the recipient of the 2015 Iowa Author Award and currently lives in Iowa City, Iowa. Welcome to the first 50 pages, Tim.
Happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
So it is pretty exciting to get to chat with an author born and raised in Iowa. As a fellow Iowa-raised kid, I can identify with the drive to get out and see the world. And in reading some of the side dishes writings on your website, and I love that name, by the way, I was so intrigued just to kind of keep going and going into all those little projects, not little, but those projects that you've done. And you've had some really cool opportunities and experiences outside of the state of Iowa. But let's talk for a second about the path that brought you to a writing career, and then what brings you back to Iowa.
The writing path began in Iowa. I was born and raised here, and grew up, vaguely aware of the Iowa Writers Workshop that is here. You may have heard of that.
Yeah,
a little bit renowned. But didn't really, as far as I knew, is where people went and built furniture. Sounded like a workshop. So I didn't know much about it. I wasn't really driven to write as a kid, except that I was into comic books and I was into drawing. And my best friend and I, he was a drawer also. We created our own comic book series, with our own kind of lineup of heroes and villains and bad guys. And after we'd drawn a comic book, I'd take it to my father's office, and he was a lawyer, law office, and make copies and take it home, put it under the Singer sewing machine and sew up the spines. They were pretty thin.
Wow.
So, and then we would take it and sell it for 25 cents to our friends at school who were gullible enough to give us a quarter. So that was kind of my introduction to kind of creating story, I guess. I was inspired by the comic books I was reading and the stories I was reading, the books that I was reading as a kid. I was a pretty avid reader. But at some point along the line, as I was working on comic books, I noticed that the written parts were getting longer than the image parts. So I think the second part of your question was what drew me back.
Yeah, what brings you back?
Yeah, so a lot happened between, once I got once I had my BA in English and my MFA in creative writing, which was a 4-year program actually. So the minute I had those 2 degrees in hand, I basically just took off and went to Japan, and I had a buddy there who was in banking and was pretty well set up there. So I kind of just sponged off of his living arrangement for a while, and I taught English to Japanese businessmen and women, which meant basically just speaking my native tongue to them and getting paid for it.
Yeah.
Pretty nice deal. Eventually ended up back in Iowa, and I fell into carpentry because my father was remodeling a house.
But one of the things that I love about this kind of story is, and we were kind of chatting about this, is that you can have a career as a writer, and still, it doesn't happen like blockbuster success. Like I think this idea that, once you've published a book, you're a blockbuster hit and everybody, there's still life to be lived, right? There's still a path of life, things to do. Like you said, you're making a living and still writing and making
Mm-hmm.
And until you then, eventually you do have the success, right? But I think it is an interesting story because that is life.
Yeah. Well, if you want to be a writer, it's pretty much a requirement that you've got to figure out a way to make a living. Because for a very long time, and maybe ever, writing is not likely to pay for it. And that's why a lot of writers go into teaching. And I just didn't really want to do that right out of graduate school. I just didn't want to, because you end up teaching a lot of introduction to writing rhetoric kind of courses, and it's tough. It's really it's a lot of work. And I did it as a grad student, so I knew what that was about. And I just found that doing something like carpentry was not only gave me more time to write, but it freed up my brain space, in a way that teaching and reading and working on other people's writing did not. But what got me back here most recently was the success you're talking about. My novel Descent came out in 2015, and it did pretty well. It was a New York Times bestseller for a hot little while, very little while, but it did well enough that it gave me a little financial space. And I've been teaching at the University of Memphis, and I took a year off to fulfill a contract for a new book. So I had that contract financing, and I had the financing that came in from Descent. And so that's when I came back to Iowa City in 2016 and rented a little house here and began to write the next novel. And it was just a sabbatical. I was just going to stay here for a year. And after about 6 months, I realized I really kind of like this life, just sitting in my little house in Iowa City and writing. And so I did go back to Memphis to finish up, the thesis I was working on there with my students. But that was it. And then I came back and settled into this little house, rented it for a while, around post-COVID. They came up for sale and I bought it, and here I sit 9 years later after moving in here.
So your latest novel, Distant Sons, was selected as the All Iowa Reads Choice for 2025 in adult fiction, and it has received critical praise from Publishers Weekly, Library Journal, and Kirkus, just to name a few. For those listeners who haven't read Distant Sons yet, can you tell us a little bit about this story?
I can. It's fairly fresh in my brain. It is the story of a small town in Wisconsin that is haunted by a tragedy that is 40 years old, when three small boys went missing in the middle 1970s. One boy per year for 3 summers running. And then nothing, no more missing boys, and no resolution to that mystery. So the town has been haunted all this while. Now we're in kind of the present day, or more or less present era anyway. And these 2 young men, who I'll talk about more in a second, arrive in town at about the same time. They don't know each other, but they meet by chance, and their meeting and their presence in town sort of rekindles the mystery of those 3 small boys, and they sort of happen into the complexities of that story and how it still affects the citizens of the town. So, and they get into their own brand of trouble here in town. And so the story must sort of find its way toward resolving not only the present day trouble that they get into as a couple of they're good people, they're carpenters, and so obviously they're good people, but they land themselves in a certain amount of trouble, just sort of by happenstance, and so that trouble must be resolved. And it also, we end up learning a lot more about those 3 missing boys, and it all sort of comes together in the end, hopefully, and resolves all the readers' burning questions.
A database that we use as librarians, as EBSCO host does it, it's called Novelist. Mm-hmm. And Novelist puts Distant Sons in the crime fiction genre, but I think it's also safe to call it a literary thriller. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to quote Kirkus reviews, and you have to pardon the cheap pun, because I think they really nailed it for this book, right? Kirkus said, a slow burn novel that quietly elevates the fragile codes of honorable men. So can we chat for a minute about how a story evolves for you in the writing process? Are you drawn to writing literary thrillers?
Well, no. I've kind of evolved into it, um, not by accident, but without really trying to do so. All my training and all my ambition was for literary writing. But something happened after I got out of school and I was on my own and I was working on stories. And I began, and you'll see this, or I would see it, and other people would notice it in the stories that eventually became the collection Irish Girl, is that there were, things were getting a little more dangerous and serious and with higher stakes in those stories. They weren't always figured out, but a lot of, people started going missing and there was tragedy. And I think at some point I wanted to write stories that had more danger in them or something that made it more, that just raised the stakes for the characters. I was still writing about characters, and that's I think what really makes the literary difference is you're really kind of exploring character and
Yeah.
mind and heart of people. But I was exploring how their characters responded to um, violence and random acts of misfortune. And so I always still thought of myself as a literary writer, and I was just writing the best novel I could, but I also was putting in uh, elements that I thought sort of raised the stakes on my characters and made their decisions and their consequences more, what do you call it, salient.
And that is one of the things that I was impressed with about Distant Sons. There is suspense in the story. It is the slow burn suspense, right? But I was still.
Not a term I'm fond of, by the way.
Oh, really? No, I was just saying that I appreciate that because I struggle when the tension is too high and I have to flip pages too fast and I can't settle in and enjoy the story. So this was a kind of story that I really lean into and like. And part of the reason is the way you crafted the book in a way that you really ask the reader to think, feel, and engage with deeper layers of the narrative. There are so many interesting discussion points throughout the book, so many layers in the characters, and their struggles with past trauma. And I think I could talk to you all day about just the ideas of masculinity that go through the book. Some moments are really quite heartbreaking, and some moments are just maddening. You don't hold back in a lot of ways in the story. And one of my favorite questions I think that comes up, I'm just going to share with you. But it was when Mr. Givens asks in the book, and he's kind of having a conversation in his head with himself, but I'd like to think he's also having a conversation with his wife in that moment. Is a man good if he isn't bad? When I read that, I just wanted to pause and like kind of sit with that for a while, because there was a lot of elements in that story that kind of brought us back to that question. And so then my question for you, what questions were you looking to explore in writing this book?
Well, that's a good question because I I don't really set out to explore ideas or questions. I'm really just more interested, again, with having characters, putting them in a scenario, putting them in motion, having them interact like, elements in a science experiment, and see how their trajectories and their constitutions change when they come into contact with each other. And I'm really, as much as I'm able to, I'm just trying to follow. I'm just trying to follow the natural course of things once they've been set in motion, according to who I understand these characters to be. And that isn't to say that I don't think about those things. Eventually, I do. As the novel goes on, I begin to see that I'm actually returning to certain ideas. Like there's a idea of shame in the novel that goes through a lot of the characters, and and so I go back when I'm revising and I think, well, this is an area that could be, that I think sort of writing about that, but I haven't really been very clear or explored it to its its fullest in that moment. I always used to tell and this is a quote I stole from Ron Carlson, the great short story writer who wrote a book called Ron Carlson Writes a Story. But I used to tell my students what he would say is that just keep writing, stay in the seat, stay in the room. He would say, and you can be smart later. So I get smarter as I go on, and can start to sort of work out those ideas you're talking about masculinity and shame and redemption and all those kinds of things. But I'm not really thinking about them in the process. If I am, then I'm probably not writing really honestly or truly.
The All Iowa Reads website has some interesting book discussion questions, and I don't want to spoil things for anyone planning to attend a discussion of your book. But what is it like for you to have people discussing your book now on a larger scale?
It sucks.
Oh, no.
Not the answer we were expecting.
No, I'm being silly. It's fantastic. I don't know I don't hear a lot about it. So I'm not really aware of how much of that is going on, but I sense that, this is a pretty big initiative and cooperative undertaking by a lot of people.
And kind of another question, but I think we've kind of already touched on it. Are there things that readers have picked up on in your writing that you didn't necessarily intend for? I think we kind of hit on that, with like the themes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot. Yes. Yeah. I mean, again, I'm immediately thinking of something that would be a spoiler, but I can't.
Yeah.
I won't go into that.
I know you're like,
but there are certain things that tend to come up again and again. And what I find is that some readers just get angry at you.
Oh no.
for making them feel something.
Well, true.
And so what I say is, well, I'm glad, or they're confused by something. So and so I think this is what generates this great discussions in readers groups, is that when people have different sort of reactions or responses to things that happen in the novel, and it's almost like a personal response, and they want to know what other people think, and they want to talk about it, and they get good and worked up about it, which I think is fantastic. And I've been live and I've visited book groups where after a while they just forgot I was there. They were just talking and arguing and going back and forth. But what I like to, when someone thinks or raises the idea that they were kind of something was almost too much for them or something, I say, I'm really writing for me ultimately, and I want things to be too much. I want to be surprised and devastated, and I want to feel the feels.
Me too.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, we like to feel all the feels too in what we read. So.
That's why we read, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. In an interview you did back in 2019 with Greer McAllister for the Chicago Review of Books, you mentioned that you don't read traditional thrillers or crime novels. So we have to ask, what books excite you as a reader, and what are you searching for when you go shopping or, say, browsing for books at your local public library?
Well, really, I'm looking for great story that is very well written. Now, sometimes I will read great story that's not super well written, and I'm sort of being snobby here. It goes back to my training. But after I got over reading Stephen King and everything like that when I was young, I really began to read the canon, the literary canon, and really became excited by that and by what language can do and by what sentences can do. And so I'm always looking for that. And one of the stories I reference as one of my favorite books in the last 10 years is a book called Open City by Teju Cole. which has the plot is basically this: a young man who's doing his um, psychiatry residency in New York City walks around New York City and looks at architecture and looks at art and thinks about things and talks about things. And there's very little, no one kidnaps him. He doesn't have to solve a murder. Uh, and but it's so psychologically keenly imagined and so well written that I just can't get enough of it. And I've reread that book many times. When I don't have something in hand that's new, I go back to old favorites. I go back to reading. I'm currently reading a bunch of Chekhov short stories. I go back to reading Cormac McCarthy, who I love, who does have some exciting elements, but is always writing at the highest level of sentence. And Flannery O'Connor, great short story writers that I love.
So is there a piece of advice or a pearl of wisdom that has been the most influential to you in your writing career? I'm sure there's been a lot of.
Yeah,
We're throwing the really hardest questions at you towards the end.
I think the thing that comes back to me most vividly is, a couple of things. A lot of writing books and teaching courses will talk about trying to, you've got to find your own voice. And I think that's true, but I think trying to find it is a bad way of going about it. I think you just need to write whatever it is and however you want to write in the moment. And over time, that voice will find you. And I think you could read any one of my novels or short stories and you would say, well, I think that's a Tim Johnston. If you've read enough of me, you would say I think that's a Tim Johnston piece of writing. But you might not know why. And I wouldn't know why. But you would recognize it. And as I recognize when I'm reading, some of the writers that I love. But how I got there is anybody's guess, but probably a lot of it was, influenced by the writers that I loved. And I was probably, doing some imitative writing, trying to write up to that level and failing, most likely. But eventually I settled into what you might call my own voice. And so I don't think you should try and force something like that. I think you should just write, follow what interests you, what you love, and eventually the voice will find you. That's one thing. And along those same lines, I also think you should write what you want to read.
Yeah.
If you love to read Harry Potter, then you shouldn't try to write James Joyce.
Yeah.
You should try and write Harry Potter. I wanted to write novels and short stories that I would have liked to read, and I think some of my younger reading self influenced that. I think eventually the boy who loved to read scary stories and Stephen King eventually let those things come back into his writing to some degree.
Well, thank you so much for a fantastic discussion today, Tim. We really enjoyed this, and we know readers are going to enjoy Distant Sons, and we hope that they'll find those book discussion groups.
Me too. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
And we're just going to give a little shout out to the All Iowa Reads for those listeners who may not know. The All Iowa Reads was established in 2003 to foster a sense of unity through reading. Iowans are encouraged to come together in their communities to read and talk about a single book title in the same calendar year. So libraries, book clubs, schools, and other local organizations are sponsoring discussions of this year. It is Distant Sons by Tim Johnston. So be sure to check your local libraries and communities for upcoming All Iowa Reads events.